Hi, welcome to this episode of Faith and Logic. In this episode of Faith and Logic, we are going to discuss about one of the difficult but most important topic, that is Christian ethics on war. We live in the time where there is a chaos in the world. There are wars going on. For example, there is a war between Russia and Ukraine. There is war going on between US and Iran. Israel is war with Hamas. We live in the time where there are a lot of wars going on, and as a Christian, as a believer, we may think, is war justifiable? We will explore in this video through biblical and logical framework, focusing on when and if ever war can be justified. So we are going to answer the question on whether war is justifiable or whether a Christian should engage in war. So let's just begin this video by asking the core question: is war ever justified? Christians have historically held three positions on war. First is activism, that says we should always obey government and war is always right. So that is activism. Now, pacifism says that never kill, war is always wrong. And the third position is selectivism, that says war is sometimes justified under moral conditions. We are going to look at what are those conditions in which war is justifiable. So let's just begin by looking at some of the biblical foundation. Exodus 20 and verse 13, when we read about 10 commandments, one of the commandment is thou shalt not murder. Some killing is morally justifiable. So even though it says that thou shalt not murder, the command prohibits murder but not killing. This distinction is essential. Without it, justice systems, including self-defense and law enforcement, would collapse. So if we say that thou shalt not murder, and therefore there should be no capital punishment. So without that, the law enforcement and self-defense would collapse. Some killing is morally justifiable. For example, capital punishment. In Genesis 9 and verse 6, we read, whoever sheds man blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. So again, that talks about capital punishment. Some killing is morally justifiable in case of self-defense. For example, Exodus 22 verse 2, it says, if the thief is found breaking in and he is stuck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. So if there was a thief breaking into your house, there was bloodshed, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. That was done in self-defense. Defending the innocent, that is justifiable. Not all taking of life is murder. Therefore, war is not automatically immoral. So that is the biblical foundation or biblical scripture that we can see about capital punishment, self-defense, and war defending the innocent people. In those cases, it should be justifiable. Now, the next is sanctity of human life. Bible talks about sanctity of human life. For example, in Genesis 1:27, we see God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So we are created in the image of God. We bear God's image. So therefore, human life is sacred because we are made in the image of God. This is why unjust killing is wrong, and also why protecting life can be morally required. And that is why we think that abortion is wrong, because that is killing an innocent baby in the mother's womb. Just because baby is dependent on mother, that doesn't mean that you have a right to kill a person. We bear God's image, and that is why human life is sacred, because we are created in the image of God. Now, what is the role of the government? Government are appointed by God. They have authority to use force, as we read in Romans chapter 13 and verse 4. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So again, government is bearing the sword. Government is God's servant to punish evil. Even the pagan rulers in the Old Testament, we see Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Nero, are used by God against his own people. We see the role of the government, that they are appointed by God for the specific purpose. The use of force by government is divinely authorized to restrain evil. Government is described as God's servant bearing the sword to restrain evil. This establishes that force under proper authority can be morally legitimate. So that's the role of the government. Now, let's look at a couple of objections against pacifism who says a Christian should never engage in war. They often quote the scripture from Matthew 5:39 where Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also." That is often quoted by people who support pacifism, who will say that war is not justified. Jesus is condemning the revenge, not self defense. The slap on the cheek is an insult, not the physical harm. Jesus himself did not passively accept injustice. For example, in John chapter 18, before his crucifixion, where he was before the high priest, it says, when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Do you answer the high priest like that?" And Jesus answered him, saying, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me?" So again, that was an injustice. He was slapping Jesus without any reason. So Jesus here did not passively accept injustice, and he was questioning him that, "Why have you slapped me? Why do you strike me? Have I done any evil or have I done anything bad?" There was no reason to strike Jesus. So Jesus did not retaliate violently, but he did confront injustice. This shows Christianity does not promote passive acceptance of evil. Pacifists often argue that Jesus commands nonviolence, but context shows that he is addressing personal retaliation, not abolishing justice or national defense. They often use some of the other verses that thou shalt love your enemy. If you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. Turn the other cheek. So sometimes they misquote it to say war is not justifiable. Now, let's look at another argument. People say you have to love your enemies. Love requires protection. So in John 15 and verse 13, we see Jesus said, "Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." Now, if you truly love your neighbor, let's see their house is burning. If you truly love them, you will try to save them. True love always saves. True love always sacrifices. So true love sometimes requires sacrifice. Protecting innocent life, even though force can be expression of love. So love and war are not opposite. Pacifists say that love, no violence. True love protects the innocent. Love and justice are both attributes of God. Sometimes love requires force. Failing to stop evil is not loving. It is morally wrong. Now, sin of omission. We also read two types of sin. One is sin of omission and sin of commission. Sin of omission is sometimes when you can do good, but when you do not do it. So it says in James 4:17, "Therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin." Failing to act when we should is sin. For example, if you know you're supposed to help an innocent person who is dying and you do not do that, that becomes sin. That is the sin of omission. If we can stop evil but refuse, we share moral responsibility. So that is also one of the arguments that can be given for the justification for the war. Now, selectivism, as we see, activism, pacifism, and selectivism. So, selectivism says that war is sometimes justified. For example, self defense, as we have seen, capital punishment, defensive war. So, selectivism avoids the extreme. War is not always right, but neither it is always wrong. So, let's look at some of these conditions in which a war is justifiable. For example, self-defense principle. Exodus 22 verse 2, as we have seen, killing an intruder is justified. Scripture explicitly allows self-defense. This principle extends from individual to nations. Then capital punishment in Genesis 9:6, as we have read, life for life. So in that case, it is justifiable. Defensive war, as we read in Genesis 14, when Lot, Abraham's nephew, when he was captured, Abraham had to wage war. He had to take military action. So Abraham rescues Lot through military action. God blessed this act. Melchizedek, the priest, he met Abraham and he blessed Abraham, and Abraham gave him tithe. We read that in Genesis chapter 14. So God blessed this act, showing that defensive war can be righteous. This happened before Israel's theocracy, so it applies universally. Just war framework. Now, when war can be justified, as we have seen before, in the defense of the innocent. So, war must respond to the aggression. The aggressor is morally wrong, and sometimes, in order to defend an innocent person or defend an innocent nation, sometimes you have to wage war. Justice and punishment of evil. That's another criteria where we can see that war is justifiable. So, war can be punitive. For example, World War II, that was against Hitler and his Nazi ideas. So, in that case, war is justifiable because that was to punish evil. Then, war that is declared by legitimate government. Individuals cannot declare war. Authority belongs to the government, as we read in Romans chapter 13 and verse 1. War has to be conducted justly. Even in war, moral limits still apply. So, civilians must be protected. There should be no torture, no killing of civilians intentionally. War must target military objectives only. For example, in Romans chapter 12, verse 18, it says, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. So, war, it should be last resort. Peace must be attempted first. War must be conducted justly. There should be reasonable chance of success. War should not be suicidal. We have to always count the cost. War must not be reckless. Leader must carefully evaluate the consequences. As we read in Luke chapter 14, verse 31 and 32, it says, oh, what king going to make war against another king does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000. King, when he wages war against another king, he will always check what is his opposite army strength, and then only he will wage war. So you have to always count the cost, and we have to be reasonable in the chance of success. It should not be suicidal. Or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks condition of peace. There are some times where you have to do diplomatic solution. You have to ask for peace instead of waging war. So as much as possible, peace must be attempted first. Only in the case where peace cannot be achieved with a diplomatic talk, in those cases, when it meets certain criteria for the just war, in those cases only war is justifiable, as we have seen some of the reason for the just war. Now, preemptive war, there is a clear and imminent threat. Enemy has capability. Let's see, a nuclear bomb. Terrorist about to detonate a bomb. An intervention is justifiable. When all the peaceful options are exhausted, when you run out of all the peaceful and diplomatic talk option, in that case, war is preemptive. You have to stop the enemy, or you have to stop the evil by waging war when the force is limited, when the means are just. So preemptive action may be justified, but only under strict condition of clear and immediate danger. So only in those conditions preemptive war is justifiable. There are some modern challenges that selectivism faces. For example, terrorism, nuclear war. So modern warfare raises the complex issues. However, the same moral principle still applies. So we can apply those same moral principle for the just war, and we can justify the war based on that. Now, who decides whether to wage war or to seek for the diplomatic solution? So it is again conscious plus scripture. Christian must evaluate war using biblical principles, not blind patriotism. Individuals must evaluate wars morally, not blind obedience. My country is right or wrong, not just blind patriotism, but you have to evaluate war based on the biblical principle plus your own conscience. There has to be a balance between peace and justice. Christian ethics holds both peace and justice together. Ignoring either leads to error. Now, the final thought here is that war is tragic, but sometimes it is necessary. We live in the fallen world. In an ideal world, there would be no need of war. When God created the world where there was no sin, there was no need of war. There was peace. But now we live in a fallen world where war is never ideal, but it may be necessary to restrain evil and protect the innocent. Some moral laws are higher than others. For example, torturing is wrong, but may be overridden to save thousands of lives, like ticking time bomb. Sometimes you have to follow the higher moral law when duties are conflict, and that is called graded absolutism. You always have to follow the higher moral law. So, in an order to save the thousands of lives, sometimes you have to wage war. So, in this video, we have looked at three ethical positions that people normally give for war: activism, pacifism, and selectivism. Now, activism sometimes fails because government can be wrong. Pacifism fails because it ignores justified use of force in the scripture. Selectivism, I believe, works. There is a balance of justice, love, responsibility, and biblical authority. So we can say in some scenarios, war is justifiable. War is justified only when it meets moral and biblical criteria, especially in the defense of innocent. Christians must pursue peace, but in a fallen world, love sometimes requires force to protect the innocent. So I hope this episode has helped you understanding Christian ethics on war, and I hope this will help you whenever any Christians or any believer, brothers and sisters, when they raise you a question on war, whether war is justified or not. I hope this video will help you answering those questions on war. Thank you and God bless.